Hello and welcome to the CastlePo eForum on record keeping tips and reminders. We wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. As this eForum is virtual and we are not all gathered in the same space, we recognize that this land acknowledgement may not represent the lands upon which you are now. If this is the case, we ask that you take the responsibility to appreciate the traditional territory you are currently on. The College of Audiologists and Speech-Language Pathologists of Ontario acknowledges the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We also acknowledge that Tkaronto, a Mohawk word which stands for the land where trees stand in the water, is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. This land is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge the peoples who have since time immemorial cared for the lands we now call Ontario. My name is Dana Prucci. I'm the Director of Professional Practice and Quality Assurance and a speech-language pathologist.
Hello and bonjour tout le monde. Je m'appelle Samita Joglekar et je suis la conseillère d'audiologie et la gestionnaire du programme de mentorat. And je suis une audiologiste. I'm an audiologist.
And my name is Sarah Chapman-Jay. Welcome to you all. I'm advisor for speech language pathology, professional practice and quality assurance, and I'm also a speech language pathologist.
As you can see, we are all registrants and we know what it's like to keep records. As always, we'll start off with some information about the app for the webinar. It's best to close other applications you have running to improve connections. If you do experience technical difficulties, exit from the session and then return again, and hopefully it will work. We have there's a place that you can write questions in, and staff will be monitoring the questions. We'll try to answer as many of them as possible or respond individually if we don't get to it today. And we'll probably have a frequently asked questions page, especially if themes are coming out. The recording and the slides from today will be published on CastlePo's website under the records section. And we really do want to hear from you. If you have tips on record keeping that you want to share, enter them into the questions area. Ideally, you can put the word tip so that we know it's not a question, but rather a tip. And we'll put all the tips together and share it as a resource afterwards. To share some of the great resources CastlePo already has, there was a records eForum in 2016, and the slides are available under eForums on the website. And even though those are a few years old, the regulations haven't changed, and so the information and the scenarios are absolutely still relevant. We also have the records section on the website, and this has the regulation, documentation standards, position statements, guidelines, practice advice articles, frequently asked questions, lots of resources, and of course there's your practice advice team. Contact us if you have any questions. So let's look at our agenda for today. We'll start off talking about record keeping and remind everybody about the purpose and principles. We'll look at some scenarios, and then we'll try to take some questions both during the presentation and at the end. Our goals of this session today are to help you understand and integrate record keeping practices. And we know that registrants are working very hard. Many have experienced a lot of change over the last few years, and people could be feeling overwhelmed, overworked, or even experiencing burnout. Record keeping is challenging, especially when we're overwhelmed. However, it is a requirement. It is a regulation. So these are minimum expectations that must be met. There are certain integral principles around record keeping that are important to review and remember. We also wanted to share some challenging situations. Through practice advice, quality assurance, and conduct, we are aware of some of the current challenges around record keeping, and we can all learn from these experiences. And finally, we want to help you meet the standards and avoid problems. We're going to give tips, but as I said before, we'd really love to hear from you. We want to hear about tips that work for you, maybe things that you have learned, things that you've heard from other people. For managers out there, if you have used any strategies that have helped your registrants that work with you to get their records done, please share those. That would be really great for everyone.
Thanks, Dana. So let's get into the first section of our presentation, which is to talk about record keeping purpose and principles. And all of the information in this section of the presentation comes from the practice advice article called Records and Signing Records. And we've put a link to the article here for you in the slide deck. So let's begin with some terminology to get us all on the same page. Patient record, health record, record, file, and chart all mean the same thing. Record keeping and documentation, that means the same thing. And the term patient is used to describe an individual who receives healthcare intervention from a speech-language pathologist or audiologist and is synonymous with client or student in a school setting. And from a regulatory perspective, we use the word patient because that mirrors the language in the Regulated Health Professions Act. So let's talk about the purpose of record keeping. As health professionals, we all know that record keeping is very important, but it's good to be reminded of the important purpose that it serves. So patient records are the official record of events from the initial referral to your last contact with a patient. It really tells the story of what occurred with a patient. So it answers the questions, who did what, why, when, where, and to whom. Another important purpose of record keeping is that it protects the public. So patient records serve as documentation that minimum standards are maintained and that safe and ethical practices are occurring. So for example, if you were ever selected for a peer assessment, the peer assessor would ask to see your patient records. And that's because your records would reflect, for example, how you are obtaining and documenting consent. And there's different types of consent, and we're going to talk about those different types in the scenarios later. What were your plan of care decisions? When were they made? Why were they made? Our patient records also reflect our clinical judgment. So if you made a referral, when did you make that referral and who did you make the referral to? If you discharged a patient, what were the criteria for that discharge? If you disclosed personal health information to another health professional, did you get consent for the disclosure? And who did you disclose the information to? Financial records are also a part of our record keeping. So this is all a part of what's in the record, and it demonstrates how you're meeting standards. So good record keeping practices protect the public in this way, but they also really help you because it helps you to know what you did, why, and so that you can look back at your records and be able to accurately recall what happened. Another important purpose of record keeping is that records can serve as legal or regulatory documents. So many parties can access or can request access or request a copy of our records. And for example, if a lawyer requested a copy of records for some type of investigation or a proceeding, then our patient records could serve as legal documents. And I already mentioned the regulatory purpose, which is a peer assessment. There are also government agencies like ADP or maybe an insurance company, and when they conduct audits, they may also request copies of our records. So this is another important purpose of record keeping. So now that we've talked about the purpose of record keeping or documentation, let's talk about the important principles of record keeping. So all patient records, regardless of environment, so no matter where you work, they must be accessible. And by accessible, we mean able to be viewed, able to be accessed. So patients can request a copy of their record, and you must be able to provide that when they request it. Patients have the right of access. It's also important for team members you work with. Maybe you work on a team of other regulated health professionals, and those team members need access to your records to be able to know what's happening with the patient and what the next steps are. Or maybe it's another speech language pathologist or audiologist who's taking over the patient care. So they would need access. And I also talked about how the college might need access or other parties for other purposes. So accessible is very important. Another principle is that records must be complete. And this is where the records regulation is a very, very useful resource because that regulation, it outlines all of the items that must be included in our patient records, including in financial records, which could also include receipts or invoices. And patient records being complete also means that they are up to date. So timely record keeping is important. So just a few examples of the things that the records regulation talks about are that our records must have the patient's name, their date of birth, their address and telephone number. There must be a record of every consent provided by the patient or by the patient's authorized representative, or every entry in a record must be dated and the identity of the person who made the entry must be known. So these are just 3 examples of things that are outlined in the records regulation. And you can use this regulation to make sure that at your workplace, you are meeting all of those different requirements. The next important principle is that patient records must be correct. So the assumption is that we are going to document accurately and truthfully, right? And that our records will always be accurate. We do have practice advice articles on how you can go about changing a record. So if you need to add information or if you need to correct a mistake, that can happen. You know, sometimes mistakes can be made. So we have advice around that. And patient records must be retained. And there are very specific requirements around how long you have to retain records, and those are outlined quite clearly in the regulation. So let's go through some more important principles. We've got 4 more. Patient records are a vehicle of reliable communication. So the patient record should include pertinent details and clear communication. And I've talked about some of the things that would be included. So what are your assessment results? What are your recommendations? What are the goals? What's been done with the patient? When? And what is planned next? So a question that you can ask yourself to know if your records are a vehicle of reliable communication is, if you left your position tomorrow, could a colleague or another party pick up that patient record and know what has occurred? Patient records are also part of clinical judgment, and we've talked about a lot of things that can be reflected in the record. So charting of your clinical impressions, how you've implemented the care plan, documenting information you've used to inform your ongoing clinical judgment, decisions and conclusions can all be part of your record keeping and would reflect your clinical judgment. An important principle is that patient records demonstrate accountability. And record keeping can be perhaps the most effective way of demonstrating accountability. You may be doing all of the right things as a clinician, having all of those great conversations, collaborating with your peers, making good decisions in terms of assessment and treatment. But if you're not documenting what you're doing, there's no way for you to look back and remember what you did. And there's also no way of confirming that you're meeting these very important standards. So record keeping demonstrates our accountability. And finally, record keeping is a part of risk management. So you can imagine that there is a risk of harm associated with records not being truthful and accurate, of information being missing, or of information in the record being false. And that can impact a patient, their ability to get the care that they need, or be connected with other professionals that they need for help or advice. So effective, good record keeping practices help you minimize this risk. So on this next slide, we've listed important areas of documentation. There needs to be documentation about services and intervention, communication and collaboration with others, consent, financial records, and supervision of support personnel. And we've linked here CastlePO documents that are relevant to these areas. So some of them are practice standards, practice advice articles, the regulation. And the reason we've listed these areas is because the scenarios that we're going to cover, we've designed around these areas. And the reason for that is because as practice advisors, we have encountered questions when it comes to record keeping on these areas. And these are also the areas that have come up most often in quality assurance and in conduct. So we wanted to highlight these areas through the scenarios and work through those together.
Thank you, Sumita. So yes, she's covered the purpose and principles behind record keeping, and really documentation is your best evidence. And the fact that so many of you have signed up for this e-forum, I think resonates, this topic really resonates with you all, that record keeping is something that we need to be very well informed about. The names in the scenarios are all fictitious, but as Samida said, they are based on some real situations that we've encountered through practice advice or through conduct. So these, I think, also will speak to some of you, any of you. All right, so let's start with scenario 1. So this one's focused on records as a vehicle of communication. So Usha is a conscientious, detail-oriented speech-language pathologist. However, her patient records are too long and detailed. Usha has spent hours on documentation, and her records do take a long time for others to read. So as a result, her colleagues are not reading her notes. So for example, she may have written additional information. As I greeted the patient and we walked to the therapy room, they waved at me. So what do we have to think about when we're writing our records? Obviously, the information in the patient record, it should be relevant and pertinent to the patient and their plan of care. So a patient waving is usually not relevant or pertinent unless there is a specific reason. Maybe you are analyzing their ways of communicating non-verbally, in which case, of course, you would add it as a relevant detail. But the problem is, if records are too detailed, this can also present a risk because the record is no longer a reliable vehicle of communication. So we, the three of us, reflected on this and we thought, well, what kind of tips would we think of for Usha? Would it be helpful for Usha to get some feedback from her colleagues? What information do they include in the records? If it's a shared record, Usha can look at their records and take some ideas from them in terms of how to be more succinct. She could go to other people on the healthcare team and get feedback on these. She could also maybe use some specific categories like a summary section or a recommendation section. She could take a look at the resources that we have on the CASPO website around records. She could take a record keeping course and write a learning goal. So we are going to incorporate a lot of polls during our scenarios, and you should see the first one here in front of you. So what we want you to consider is which of these goals are realistic to you in your situation? And you can check off any or all that apply to you. We'll give you some time to do that. And just to let you know, the polls are anonymous. We have no idea who selected what. So feel comfortable to put whatever you choose in these polls. Okay, so we'll give you some time. And here's some of the feedback, which is really fascinating for, I think, everyone to see. So there's high recommendations, certainly for 2, get feedback from colleagues. What do they include? For those of you that work, closely with others in the same clinic or organization, that would be fantastic. I know in the hospital situation, we're all using medical charts. So you're not just seeing your own disciplines, you're looking at other allied health professionals, other physicians, nurses, etc., how they document. You could review the record resources. Really, any of these options are good plans. I mean, it depends how much you think you need help with documentation, but reach out. I think it's a very good way to check in with others. So we're still with Usha. So she's taken some of our tips, and she's now conducting a swallowing assessment and is charting for one of her patients, Joan, who she's recently assessed. So she's working on improving her record keeping practices. So how can she document her findings succinctly? So let's imagine she has written some of these comments. A, Joan was able to eat applesauce pudding, yogurt, and lemon mousse happily and independently using a spoon. B, Joan was sitting in her wheelchair with the leg rests. C, Joan was eating out of a yellow dish and used a spoon, not a fork. D is Joan ate pureed items independently with a spoon, or the final one is all of the above. So this time, what we would like to do is choose which one of these seems to succinctly report what has been observed. So again, choose one option for this. Okay, so let's see how this one turned out. Well, this is great to see. So absolutely, I think it's unanimous for 91% of you that Joan ate pureed items independently with a spoon. Now, you're always using your own clinical judgment. If you were choosing number one, there may be some specific reasons why you felt the need to list all the pureed items, but D would be probably the most succinct, depending on how much assessment you've done and how many findings you need to report. And keeping in mind who else is reading your documentation. What do they want to know? Do they need to know that it was happily? Did they need to know that where she was sitting, and if she was talking to other people, who else was in the room? So it's really being very succinct about your details.
Okay, let's try another one with Usha, who's a very busy speech pathologist. She's now assessing Timmy, a late talking preschooler. What could her records succinctly say about his play? So we'll launch another poll and pick the one that's most succinct. Timmy played with the doll by feeding it with a spoon and bottle. Timmy pretended to serve the doll tea and cookies. Timmy dressed the doll and put it in a stroller. Timmy demonstrated appropriate sequence pretend play, or all of the above. Okay, so again, we have a few choices, but there's one that's standing out, which is the simple line that Timmy demonstrated appropriate sequence pretend play. I will note that some people said all of the above, and while we think that D is the best to be succinct, that's important if you're writing things in a record where the people that will be seeing the record in general are you or other people where you want it to be a good vehicle of communication. So people like occupational therapists, early interventionists, or ECEs who will know what sequence play would be. On the other hand, if you're writing this information in a report and the parents are going to be the recipients, you might want to give an example so that you're reducing or explaining any jargon to say this is what sequence play would be.
Okay, so let's get into another scenario, and we're still talking about records as a vehicle of communication, and this is an audiology scenario. So Kieran, an audiologist, conducts an audiological assessment. The result is an asymmetrical hearing loss. So to be succinct, she writes only one note in the report. And that note says, asymmetrical hearing loss, recommend ear, nose, and throat ENT specialist consult. She later learns that the referral was not made because the family physician did not understand the reason for the recommendation and therefore did not make the referral. So this is a bit of a different situation compared to Usha, where Usha was including too much detail. Now perhaps there isn't enough detail. So we're putting this out as a question to you in a poll. What additional information could Kieran include that would back up her recommendation? So nothing, the recommendation should be sufficient on its own. Explain in brief and clear language her clinical reasoning for the recommendation. Include more information about the assessment results. Or could she offer a conversation with the physician on current research on asymmetrical hearing loss? Okay, thank you very much for your participation. And it looks like the majority have said that Kieran could explain in brief and clear language her clinical reasoning. And some have suggested that she could include more information about the assessment results, and that's a good suggestion too. But let's have a look at which answer we thought would be the best, and we agreed with you that B would be probably the best additional information. So just saying asymmetrical hearing loss and making the recommendation is not enough in this case. Kieran needs to give more information to explain why the finding of asymmetrical hearing loss is important to be further investigated, and then why that's leading her to make that recommendation for the ear, nose, and throat doctor. So what are some tips for Kieran? A big one is to collaborate and communicate effectively. And so she can provide the rationale, additional information, observations, and findings. So some of you said more information about the assessment, and that would be good. There could also be information that the patient has shared in case history that would be important to include to help her explain why she's making the recommendation. She can be a source of information for her colleagues who may rely on her knowledge and understanding. So we can't always assume that our colleagues are going to know why our findings are clinically important, why they may be red flags. So we need to provide enough information and in jargon-free language as much as possible. She could offer her contact information to the physician for further discussion. That might be very helpful. Or she could provide an in-service for physicians on the clinical findings that would lead her to make this recommendation.
Excellent. So this is our first opportunity for some questions, and we're already seeing questions and tips coming in, which I think is fantastic. So I might just start with the tip, because I think this one was for Usha. And again, it won't apply to all of you. We all have different needs in terms of our record keeping. But one tip was to integrate the individualized goals, objectives from the treatment plan into the individualized note template for each client. So again, you could have these special templates and ways to document things. So objectives in one column, level accuracy in another column, and comments in a third column. So really it's you choosing how you can best document the types of intervention you're doing. And another question we have, sorry, not another, but the first question I would say actually, are notes required when completing hearing screenings?
So thank you for that question. So in the records regulation, it does talk about what you need to document when you're conducting a screening. So if it's a group screening, it specifies you need to document certain details about the person who participated, the date, and perhaps the result if it was pass or refer. So the answer is that yes, you do need documentation when conducting screenings, and it's best to go to the records regulation because it talks about exactly what you need to document.
Mm-hmm. And then that's excellent. Thanks, Samida. Another question is there a time frame in which charts and reports must be completed by? So I'll start with this. You know, again, Samida was referring to the Records Regulation 2015, and being complete means being up to date. So you want to put in the documentation as early as possible. Depends where you're working. I know when I was working part-time in one place, I never wanted to leave that week without completing my documentation for that week. In a hospital situation, literally you could be followed by somebody, I don't know, 5 minutes after you've seen the patient. So in that setting, you want to document immediately, as soon as you can within that day. I don't know if either of you have some additional comments around this.
Yeah, absolutely. So it really depends on what your workplace has said. I know of other places that will say it has to be done in 48 hours or within the week. That's why on the self-assessment tool, indicator 1.2 that talks about having your records completed in a reasonable time, we said a reasonable time because it depends on your workplace. It depends on the situation. If you're working with people in a medical situation where things need to be done quickly or something like that. So there's no hard and fast rule as far as CASAPO goes on what a reasonable time would be. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again. I think we can take some more of these questions afterwards. Okay, so let's move on to scenario 3, and this is about documentation of consent. So a reminder, there are 2 types of consent, and it's really important that you're aware and that you document both of them. So the first one we'll talk about is consent for intervention, which is part of the Healthcare Consent Act. And this is also known as informed consent. So in this scenario, in his private practice, Manuel always has an informed consent conversation with patients and their families. However, he doesn't use consent forms and doesn't always document in the record that informed consent was obtained. And this is really common. Manuel's intentions are good. He has the conversation with the patients, which is amazing. But by forgetting to document, again, something seen in quality assurance and conduct, this is an area that needs to be addressed. So let's see what some of the steps are that he could take. So we will open this up as a poll. So you can pick all that apply. Manuel can come up with a system like a consent form or a checkbox to ensure consent is documented for every patient. He can talk to current patients and families to get and document consent next time he sees them. He can document consent for new patients, or he can go through discharge files of previous patients and document consent. So you can
Thank
see
you for your participation. I'm just going to share the results.
Excellent. And with apologies that we're not necessarily giving everyone enough time, but we do want to get through everything. So it's interesting. We've got lots of votes. Everybody thinks having a system is a great way to do it. Many people agree with B and C about talking to current patients and new patients. And there's a few votes for documenting consent in the discharge files. So let's see what we have thought of internally. So we thought A, B, and C are really the best answers. Coming up with a system, you don't have to use a consent form, but it might just be a way to make sure it gets done all the time, talking to current patients and then talking to new patients. And the reason that we said that D isn't as good an answer to go back through files, well, there's a few reasons, but one of them is specifically in quality assurance. We always make the adjustment in your practice going forward. So we talk about what you can and should be doing going forward, getting a system in place to document consent for every patient instead of looking backwards. Again, consent isn't about a piece of paper, but you do have to document the conversation. 3.1 in self-assessment tool talks about I obtain and document consent for all intervention plans or courses of action and any significant changes thereafter. So let's take a look at what some of those significant changes could be. It would be, you would need consent for things like assessments or new assessments, interventions and changes in the plan. Support personnel, you could say, you've always worked with me, but I want to introduce a support personnel. You need consent for that to be documented. Change in goals, video fluoroscopic studies, and stream management, and of course, if you'll be using an interpreter. So you don't need to get consent every session if the goals and all of these other things are staying the same. Some tips for Manuel would be to reach out to colleagues. Also in the self-assessment tool, we talk about having a professional network. So he should be reaching out to his network and see what do they do to document informed consent. If he works with others, they should have a team meeting and come up with a system that everyone can follow. CastlePo has a really great resource of the consent tool that you can find online under consenting capacity page. And also talk about what kinds of consent actually come up in the office pretty regularly, because those are the ones that should be most easily obtained and documented.
All right, so let's look at another scenario about documenting consent. And in this scenario, we're talking about a different type of consent. And this is the consent to collect, use, disclose, and retain personal information. So this is different from informed consent. This is also known as knowledgeable consent. And the law that is associated with this, or the piece of legislation, is the Personal Health Information and Protection Act, or PHIPA. So we might also call it PHIPA consent. So Leslie is a busy audiologist who uses checkboxes on the audiogram, and she documents by ticking a checkbox that says consent obtained. So the question we want to ask is Leslie's checkbox for consent obtained enough to meet CastlePo's standards? And we're going to launch this as a poll because we'd like to know what you think. So is the checkbox labeled consent obtained enough? Yes, it's what most audiologists do. It depends, maybe, if the two types of consent are clear, or unsure. All right, we can see that responses have come in. And okay, so it looks like the majority have said it depends. If it could be if the two types of consent are clear. Now, we didn't give no as an option, so people might have selected between it depends and unsure. 20% or 19% say unsure, and 9% say yes, this would be enough. So let's have a look at the answer that we came up with. And we think that it's B. So it depends, okay? And let's talk through this. So if Leslie can show that that one checkbox on the audiogram covers both types of consent, so informed consent for the intervention and consent to collect, use, and disclose personal health information, then maybe that one checkbox would be enough. But Leslie would have to show that this one checkbox covers both types of consent. And so she could show that by being able to describe the process in her clinic, being able to show a policy that this is what the team members in this clinical setting do, and that's how we all document both types of consent. If this isn't clear, then that one checkbox would not be enough, right? It might be indicating informed consent, consent for assessment, treatment, consultation, but it wouldn't be enough to indicate the consent that you need from the patient to collect, use, retain, and possibly disclose their personal health information. So the conversations about consent are absolutely essential and very important. As we mentioned before, the conversation is more important than a consent form, but the documentation must also be clear that both types of consent have been obtained and documented. And this is reflected by the indicators in our self-assessment tool, 3.1 that talks about informed consent, and then 3.2 that talks about knowledgeable consent. So let's talk about some tips for Leslie. So checkboxes are a great idea. No problem with checkboxes. They can be a very quick and efficient way of documenting. But a tip could be that Leslie could have separate checkboxes, one to indicate that informed consent has been obtained, another to indicate that the PHIPAA consent has been obtained. It's also possible that a patient won't give their consent or that they can withdraw their consent. Patients are allowed to withdraw consent at any time. So there needs to be a way of documenting that, perhaps a place for comments on the form, or maybe you document that as a note in the patient record. Whatever process it is, that's really up to you to decide, or your workplace or your team. CASLPO does not have requirements that you must have consent forms or have a particular way of doing this, but the regulation that you have to meet is that the consent, both types, must be clearly documented. And so Leslie should ensure that whatever process she's using is achieving that. So we're sticking with Leslie, and in Leslie's office, the receptionist offers to obtain consent around collecting, using, and retaining personal health information. This is a conversation that the receptionist says they're going to have with the patient when they open the patient record. And this is not a polling question. We're just going to talk through this. So would this be an acceptable practice? So yeah, you might think yes, because by using this practice, knowledgeable consent would be obtained and documented, so that's fine. You might think no, because the receptionist isn't a CASLPO registrant. They shouldn't be carrying this part out. Or maybe you're not sure. So let's look at what we thought, and the answer is yes. So the receptionist can be the one to carry out this conversation. So as an audiologist and speech language pathologist, you don't always have to be the one having the consent conversation. It might be that you are, or it might be somebody else on your team. It might be a receptionist. It doesn't have to be a regulated health professional. But our responsibility as regulated health professionals is to ensure that somebody on the team has had that conversation, that the patient has been informed, and that that consent has been obtained and that it's documented. That's our responsibility. Okay, so let's look at one more scenario with Leslie. So now Leslie needs to send a report to an ear, nose, and throat specialist, or this could be a family doctor. And Leslie talks to the patient and obtains consent from the patient to send the report, but she doesn't document that she got consent from the patient to disclose their personal health information. So again, Leslie has had that conversation, which is fantastic. But we talked about demonstrating accountability in the first part. So she's had the conversation, she's done the right thing, but she hasn't documented that she got that consent. And the fact that it's not documented is the problem. So she needs to make sure that she documents. Document, document, document.
Okay, now we're going to move to financial records for scenario 5. Hassan, who's an audiologist, works for a large hearing healthcare practice. And when the patient purchases a hearing aid, this is what the receipt says. It lists the clinic, it lists the patient, it lists the services, it tells you the date it happened, how much was charged, what the total paid amount was, and if there was any owing. So let's just check this receipt out. If we're thinking of the financial records, does it have all the important information on this? So we are going to ask you to decide if there was anything missing. And here are the questions. What is missing? Because there was one piece of information missing. So was it the registrant's name? Was it the patient's name? Was it the length of the appointment? Was it the color of the hearing aid? So we'll just give you a moment to pull and put it in your selection. One of these would be the correct one. Okay, and let's take a look at the results. So yes, so the majority noticed, and it was the registrant's name missing. A couple wondered about the length of the appointment and maybe the patient's name. We did have the patient's name in there, and I appreciate we did show it to you very quickly. So that was almost like a memory test as well. That was not intentional. All right, so it was the registrant's name. And why are we pointing this out to you? Because we introduced 1.10 last year in the self-assessment tool, so you all would have looked at it this year as well. For any of you that are writing invoices for patients, an essential part is that you include your name. So the name of the clinic on its own is not sufficient. They would like to know who you are as the registrant. So that is an important detail to add. And if we look at the financial records, what must be contained are all of the following. So the patient's name, your name, not just the clinic's name, the name of the provider of the service, sometimes it might be somebody else, could have been support personnel, a CDA, the service or product provided, the date of the service or product, the fee charged for each professional service or product, and the total fee charged, and a record of receipt given by or on behalf of the registrant. So as you can see, the one that stands out that we noticed anyway in quality assurance last year, one that was missing was the registrant's name. So hopefully this will be good new information for any of those that may not have been aware of that.
Okay, so we had a place for questions, but I'm going to suggest we skip it and just take more questions at the end to make sure that we can get through the e-forum.
A couple more scenarios, yes, okay.
Exactly. Okay, our next scenario is timely record keeping. Again, this is something that comes up often, that people do struggle with getting their records done in a reasonable time. So this is about Esther. Esther is a speech language pathologist working in the school board. She drives between schools, handling a very heavy caseload. At the end of the day, she's tired and can't seem to complete her charting. She knows she's falling behind in her record keeping, but she doesn't want to let her boss know. Esther is feeling burnt out from the pace of work and the demands on her time. So what should Esther do? So we will launch a poll, about what Esther should do about her late notes. So should she just keep pushing through? Surely things will get easier. Should she be using vacation time to complete her charting, talking to her manager, or looking into other note-taking options? And again, you can choose more than one thing. Okay, so we have some great results here. Really, so the majority of people are saying talk to her manager and look into other note-taking options. So I will share what we were thinking, which are exactly those two. Keep pushing through, it'll get easier. hate to say, but it probably won't, because this is really a problem for her right now. And taking vacation time, that's such a sad thing to do, because she needs to have a way to recuperate. So let's go over some tips for Esther. She really should be talking with her manager, her coworkers. If she's a relatively new grad and has a mentor or a mentor she worked with in the past, that's a great person to reach out to, and really just ask for help. We get lots of calls in the practice advice team, so you can call a practice advisor. We recommend, especially to new grads, set up good habits to keep your records up to date, and that's really good for anyone. I feel like good habits breed good habits. And finally, look into technology that can help. There's lots of voice to text things that are available now, especially if writing or typing out the records are a problem for you. I can tell you that something that I did in my private practice, I was driving from patient home to patient home, and I would get home at the end of the day and I couldn't remember what I had done with the first patient or the middle patient of the day, and what their data would have been. So I would drive home and leave myself a voicemail. You want to think about things like confidentiality, but I was alone in the car. There was no one with me. And I had saved the voicemail on a voicemail that I was the only person that had access to. I also didn't leave names. I might say, I remember what I did with each patient, or I might say the time. You can capture these things quickly while the memories are fresh, and you don't have to create them at the end of the day. This might be true if you're in the car and driving a lot. Maybe you visit lots of long-term care homes, schools, or people's houses. After leaving the message, though, you still need to write down what you said and then delete the message. And this is just a way that I found that my records could be kept up to date and in a timely manner. We also can think about, why is it important to have this conversation with a professional practice leader and manager? And we can all go back to the code of ethics. It's important to be honest with yourself and others, which is a really important part of professionalism. It's definitely better to get a handle on this before it's out of your control, and you want to be accountable. We don't want to sit on this problem and let it fester, because, again, that's not going to work. If we take things further, what would happen if Esther didn't talk to anyone and didn't get any help? In fact, she's so burnt out and feels so behind on her notes that she leaves the job and takes another position somewhere else. What happens next? Well, really, it'll catch up with you one way or another. You are still accountable after you leave a job. This could come up as a complaint or a report to CASAPO. Again, these scenarios we're talking about are based on real situations. This catches up with people and could become a complaint. Missing documentation is not meeting standard of the profession. And imagine it, that you've left your job, or Esther has left her job, and records behind, and the students are still being seen. For Esther, this would mean another speech pathologist will pick up the students and the records, but find that they don't know what happened in therapy. If you consider the principles that Samita talked about in the beginning, the records are not complete or correct, they're not reliable, and they're presenting a risk when missing information. For example, here, the new speech pathologist may need to repeat an assessment unnecessarily. However, the same tool can't be used within 6 months, but the new speech pathologist doesn't know what had happened.
Okay, thanks, Dana. All right, scenario 7. This now is about how important it is to document when you are supervising support personnel. So Miriam is an SLP. She works with a communicative disorders assistant who she knows is excellent at her job. She's very comfortable assigning her clinical activities to do with her patients. So Miriam has obtained and has documented consent from the patient for the CDA's involvement. So this is a great start. Now she's assigning some clinical activities. So we're going to ask you, well, what evidence does Miriam need to show that she continues to supervise the CDA and that she is updating and revising the goals? So this one isn't going to be a poll, but so here are some ideas of how she could document. And just for yourself, think about how you might document the way you supervise support personnel. So you could choose to document your meetings between the registrant and the support personnel, document emails that go back and forth between you, maybe have a question about the photo of Miriam and CDA at her desk. I mean, they could be talking about anything, their lunch, what they're doing at the weekend. What about time spent on goals being updated and revised? Could they document how they've monitored assigning the clinical activities? Could they co-sign progress notes? Could they review progress notes? Would it be helpful to send emails to the whole clinic on the patient's goals? Is it helpful to have an internal clinic policy on support personnel supervision, or all of the above? So just thinking in your situation, when you supervise support personnel, are any of these ways to document useful ways? And really what we want to know is evidence that Miriam is supervising her CDA. So the ones that we've selected are the ones that are highlighted in green for you. So yes, any documentation about meetings between Miriam and the support personnel, emails with the support personnel, anything that shows that time was spent on the goals jointly, co-signing progress notes and reviewing the notes. So I think it is important to really think about not just, yes, you're accountable to supervise support personnel, but you need some evidence, some documentation evidence to show that you are doing that supervision. And I will just add in here, I know that in conduct, this unfortunately has come up as a situation where they've had a complaint come in. CDAs have clearly been providing intervention for not just months, but years. And while the records say that the SLP reviewed the notes, there is no adjustment in the treatment goals, little or no progress in that patient improving or their communication skills being enhanced. So it does beg the question, was there actual supervision? So for this, supervising support personnel, your evidence, your best evidence is documentation to go with this. So tips for Miriam would be check in on a regular basis with the support personnel, have some documentation to prove that there is that ongoing supervision, find a method that works between Miriam and the support personnel, and do find ways to document that communication. And as you probably know, there are resources on our website on supervision. We have position statements on the use of support personnel for audiologists and for speech language pathologists.
Okay, and we've come to our last scenario now. And this is actually a question that we received from a registrant. Again, the name in the scenario is fictitious. So Kalinda, a school board SLP, goes into the classroom to consult with the kindergarten teacher on early literacy strategies. She models the techniques by teaching the whole class during literacy activities. If 2 of the students in the class are Kalinda's patients, does Kalinda need to enter notes in their student records? And so we are actually going to launch this as a poll. No, she is providing consultation of a general nature, so she doesn't have to do documentation. Yes, the students are her patients, so she needs to document, or it depends. Okay, thank you very much for participating. So we've got a variety of answers here. An equal percentage of you think it depends, or yes, the documentation needs to happen. 24% think no, documentation is not necessary in this case. So let's talk through the answer. And the answer that we came up with is no, Kalinda in this case doesn't need to document because she is providing consultation of a general nature to the teacher and for the whole class. So it's not about just the 2 students who are her patients, but she's talking about literacy strategies that could be applied to any of the students in the class. She's not providing any direct one-on-one intervention in this case. She's not developing specific goals or plans for those students. If she was, then that would be a different situation, but for consultations of a general nature, the record keeping would not be required. Okay, so we've come to questions, and I just wanted to say there have been many questions coming through Thank you very much. We may not be able to get to them all, but we are planning to stay over time to address questions, maybe about 10 minutes. We know that many of you may have to leave right at 1 o'clock, so the session is being recorded and you can go back and watch the Q&A portion, but we will continue to go about 10 minutes later than 1 o'clock.
Excellent. All right. So yes, as Sumita said, we will try and answer as many questions as possible right now. But again, there are more than we'll manage, I believe. Let's start with one, which is for supervision of CDAs, do we need to print the emails or just write in our progress notes that we discussed by email? So again, this is optional. Now, if any of you are being peer assessed, then any extra evidence of you supervising CDAs, arranging how to do that supervision, if the email is good evidence to show this, it's going to be your decision what you choose to provide as evidence in that situation. Again, we had some tips earlier about what would work as documentation evidence, so review those as well.
Okay, I noticed that there were several questions that came in about consent when there's a circle of care. So for teams where there are various health professionals involved in providing services or care for a patient, do you have to get consent if you're going to share information with other people who are in the circle of care for the patient? And the documents that describe PHIPAA say that you don't have to, in that case, get consent every time. The assumption is that the patient knows who's in their circle of care and that they understand that that communication and collaboration is happening between the different health professionals. So if there's something that changes, you know, a significant change, like a new health professional is coming in or a different assessment is going to be used, or there's something that's changing, then you would need to get consent. But for sharing information with people who are in the circle of care, you don't have to repeatedly get consent. I don't know, Sarah or Dana, if you would want to add anything.
I agree with that. The only part that I would say is you still want to talk about the other type of consent, the informed consent for services, where you're talking about the nature, the benefits, the risks, the side effects, potential side effects, consequences, and alternatives. So yes, for the PHIPAA Act, you're good with that around the circle of care, but there is still the other type of consent. Okay, another question.
So, I saw a couple of good consent to obtain, collect, use, retain personal health information. There were a couple that came in, so I might try to combine them together. The first is, if a patient declines giving consent, what can you do? So I know that when I worked in the preschool speech and language program, the person who did the intake got consent, and there was one time that a family declined. And so when they came in for the appointment, I actually had a chance to speak with them and explain how the database works, and it's not something that anyone can have access to. These are how the files work, and there were paper files at that time. So once they understood more about it, they were very happy to give consent. And on the other hand, there's something called a lockbox where you can have, it's not even a physical lockbox, but there are certain restrictions that you can put into place so that no one else can see any of the information that's in the file. But it's all about that conversation and explaining why you want the information and what you're going to be doing with it. And there was also a similar question about whether that kind of consent is needed if you're in a private practice. It still is. Both kinds of consent are very important, and that's why we wanted to talk about how there's two types of consent, one for intervention and one is about your personal health information. Because even in a private practice, you'll have records, whether those records are a paper file that you keep in a drawer or some very secure system that you use online, you still need to have records and you still need patient consent to have those records.
I see a question that says, can you please provide us with information on the storage of electronic records? So the requirements around the storage of records would be the same, whether they are electronic or on paper. And those requirements are that you have to retain the record for 10 years from the last patient contact if it's an adult above the age of 18. If it's a patient that is under the age of 18, you have to keep the record for 10 years from the date that they would have turned 18. And so those requirements apply for electronic records as well. So you would need to make sure that records can be retained for that length of time.
Okay, I see another question, and it says, if you are in a sole private practice, how detailed do session notes need to be? So it sounds like you are working alone, not sharing your notes with others, but at any point, the patient can request access to the records that you would need to provide within 30 days. So you would want those notes to be, again, a vehicle of reliable communication to whoever may request that access. And, you know, over time, there are situations where suddenly you have to close your practice or chose to close your practice. So it could be that somebody else becomes that health information custodian when you close the practice. And so they would also need these notes to be legible, and again, to be a vehicle of reliable communication. So even though you're not typically sharing them with anybody else, you want to look at ways that they continue to be correct, accessible, retained in the right amount of time.
Sorry, we're taking a long time. There's a lot of excellent
Yes.
questions that are coming in here.
Yes.
And again, we're also looking for tips. If you have any tips for things that have worked with you, worked for people that you have worked with, people on your staff, please do share them.
Go ahead.
I was going to say there's a few questions coming in about documenting emails. And this is not something that CastlePo itself, again, has any rules on. It's been different in places that I've worked. In the hospital, they said, do not print off emails because they're not reliable, which I always thought was kind of funny because to me they seem the most reliable. But you would have to then, they were paper files at the time, but write a note in the file or document it on the electronic file to say that this was the email and this was the general gist of it. Some places say, no, do put records in the emails in the file because that way you could see exactly what happened. But if the email is something that has to do with the intervention, if it is a professional email, then it should be in there, whether it's changing the dates or agreeing to goals, giving consent, talking about the homework. Those are things that should be in the record.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have another question. These are fantastic questions, everybody. Thank you. Can we use short forms in records? And I think that's an excellent question. It really, again, depends who you are sharing those records with. I think we all know we have jargon or terminology that we use, short forms, SLP on its own, ORD on its own. So I think if it's shared documents with other people, like I've worked with in interdisciplinary situations, it is good to have a legend. If you're frequently using the same acronyms or short forms and it's a shared record, then you know, having a legend, having something that helps each other understand, because it is tiresome to have to write down speech language pathologist every time. So maybe the first time you do your signature, you write out your full name, Sarah Chapman J, speech language pathologist, but then after that, it could just be SCJ and SLP. So it's okay to use them, but really always thinking about when and how and who is involved with these records.
Mm-hmm. I see a question here. It says, in terms of dating a record, does it have to be dated when the note is completed, or should the date indicate when the appointment occurred for records that are not completed immediately? So this, if you're going back and adding notes at a later date, that, you know, different date from when the session actually occurred, the best practice would be to put the date when you're making the note and then reference the date when the appointment happened, right? So if you think about it, then when you go back, you know that, okay, on this date I made the note, but this is regarding an appointment that happened in the past on such and such date. So that's the advice we would give for that. The same thing would be if you were adding information or correcting a mistake, for example. You would want to add the information, but then put the date that you're adding the information, but then reference the session that you are referring to. the date of the session. Another maybe quick question to answer is PHIPAA consent needed in private practice? And the answer is yes, it is. So that consent is needed in any type of practice that you may be involved in. So you need to ensure you have a process for obtaining and documenting consent to collect, use, disclose, retain personal health information of patients.
I see another one here. Are full assessment reports required if an assessment is conducted and service is not indicated? Would a chart note suffice? So in general, reports are not, I think it depends on your workplace. Reports are not absolute requirements after you do an assessment, but again, depending on the place of your work. So again, in my private practice, it's a way that I felt I could save patients money if they just wanted to go through speech therapy to help their child. They weren't sending the report to anyone, they weren't sharing it with the school or any other professionals. Then I would say put that money, save the money on the report, and we'll put it towards therapy. So I would just make sure that everything was documented in my records. And if they ever did need a report, I could do it because I had those records. So for someone who doesn't need therapy, I think it depends on your workplace. There are some workplaces, some private practices, again, thinking about the PSL, possibly school boards, where you do have to have an assessment, even an assessment report, even if it says everything's fine, they're doing great. So I think that's more of a question for the workplace.
Mm-hmm. I have another question here that I noticed a lot of doctors, I see dictate notes by voice, and at the bottom of their note, they have a caveat that there may be some errors in syntax and grammar. It seems very easy and fast. Is this currently permissible? If that is your, I mean, I've done that as well. I've used to have to dictate video fluoroscopy reports, and maybe I've said a word and it's medication that gets misspelled or something like that. So I think that would be acceptable. You obviously, if you're dictating, you would want to try and, I ended up spelling out more complex words. That could be a possibility. Yeah, I think that's my main answer to that. Anything to add to that?
No, I think that sounds reasonable.
Yeah.
There are a couple of questions about if two SLPs are discussing a client, how this should be documented. So if two SLPs are having a discussion, I think it depends on which SLP is the one providing the patient intervention. So who is the primary care provider for that patient? And I mean, of course, we consult with our colleagues, but the SLP who's consulting, you know,
and has opened up a patient record for that patient.
Yeah, that SLP should be taking the responsibility. I'm thinking of documenting, and you could document that you consulted with a colleague. Again, it helps you to look back and know why you made certain recommendations or what you did. So that would be fine, and that would be how you could document those types of discussions.
Mm-hmm. Although if it's somebody who's you're transferring a patient, I know sometimes from acute care to rehab or something, then you both end up with your own records. So, and you've had that conversation about maybe passing on, transferring that care. So then both would make a note in their records.
Right.
I see a question that I think can be quick. It's something we talked about earlier. If a services invoice is raised by a retail company software, does the audiologist's name still have to be on there? Yes, it does. And this is especially true that we found in quality assurance this past year, that audiologists' names were often left off of the software report that was created, the receipt or the invoice. So what you need to do as the registrant would be to talk to your manager, talk to the right people in the company to say that your name needs to be on there. If it's impossible, then I suppose you could just write your name on the receipt. I think that happens like at massage therapy appointments, is that like the receptionist can write the name, or you can write the name, but your name as the audiologist or speech pathologist has to be on the receipt. Okay, we have so many wonderful questions.
I know.
Tips.
Okay.
keep going, but I think we're going to have to call it for today. We will be posting the slides and this recording to the website, as we said before, and we'll be trying to get back to as many people as we can and creating a frequently asked questions document that everyone can access on the website. That hopefully your questions will be in there, and if they're not, reach out to Practice Advisor because these are really great. And even after today, please do continue to send us tips. We want to have the best ones out there that we can share, and we appreciate everyone who sent them in already today.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.